All right, this is the second part. I started off talking about this health crisis update today. I talked about numbers, uh, what we see in the news, and a little bit perspective of what that means in the bigger picture. I even started just a bit of a conversation that I'm going to elaborate on next, and that's how these numbers get caught up in our head and change our mindset. And those numbers do make a difference in how you're paying attention, and it turns on different parts of our brain. And so when we open up the news today, for example, and we see that there's 5,000 deaths, that lights up this part of our brain called the midbrain or the amygdala. The term that we actually use is a reptilian brain, because that's actually our brain of survival. When we hear anything that sounds fearful and worrisome and concerning, it'll turn that part of our brain on. And the problem is if you've seen that information day in and day out and constantly, and you're sitting in an unreal situation that we're in right now, what happens is that just turns on that part of the brain. And a lot of us just get stuck going in circles and circles in this part of our brain. And the problem with that part of the brain is it's not a very, even though that's termed the survival part of our brain, we don't really do a lot of surviving there. The problem is that part of the brain just mostly reacts, and so it just reacts with a lot of emotion. It puts us in states of fear. It puts us in a state of anxiety. We stop sleeping. We start noticing different changes in our health. But more importantly, we start feeling helpless and stuck. And that's not a good place to be in this day and age, or at least when we're dealing with these types of situations. But those of us who find that we can't do anything, it's because we're sort of stuck in this midbrain, following all this information coming to us that's really fearful and scary. And I agree that a lot of times the fear is coming from, we don't even know a lot about this, and that actually turns on our amygdala. But we won't know a lot unless we start testing and giving it more time. But the important part about that is because we're bombarded with this type of information, it gets us stuck in this part of our brain. And that part of our brain is not a good place to be over time, because it turns on cortisol, which is our stress hormone. And as we sit in too much cortisol, we stop sleeping. And if we stop sleeping and we have too much cortisol, it turns on our inflammatory responses. We become hypersensitive with inflammatory responses. And then on top of that, overall, it decreases our overall immune health. And so if there comes a time that we're exposed to this virus, having been in this situation may not be to our benefit. It might actually decrease our ability to fight off a virus. I suspect this is what happens to my colleagues who are seeing the virus face-to-face, 40-year-old doctors and nurses and those in the medical community who are generally young and healthy, who are having really complex infections or death. They are sitting in too much cortisol right now. They're not sleeping. They're getting constantly bombardments of exposures, and now they don't have a very good immune health, what we would have expected from a 40-year-old or a young person. So this isn't a good place to be. So for those reasons, staying focused on this isn't a good thing. The flip side to that is if we can jump out of this midbrain and find a way to get up to a different part of our brain called the prefrontal cortex, we would be in a better position. This is the prefrontal cortex, which is actually the part of our brain that makes us different from other animals. It's the part of the brain that actually has allowed us to survive and thrive. So this essentially is the part of the brain that helps us really survive, and to survive because we figure things out. In our prefrontal cortex, we tend to be more rational. We can take this information, and then instead of just focusing here, now we look at the bigger picture and say, well, there's 300 million of us, and really 80% of us are going to probably be okay. And quite honestly, a lot of us, we can flip a coin, heads or tails, that's going to decide if we're going to have this virus or not. And so if we can see this macroscopically, we can say, okay, if most of us will be fine with being exposed to this virus, I can be proactive. Well, if I'm going to get exposed to this, maybe I need to do something now about being proactive for this in anticipation or preparing for an exposure. And then I can start planning. And in this mindset is actually where you can find health. In this mindset, you can actually change. You can actually move. You're too stuck when you're stuck in that midbrain. You just sort of go in circles there. Here's where you start planning. You start executing. You start changing. You start deciding, making a decision, and following through on decisions. It's a whole different part of your brain. But this actually takes a lot of effort to be in this part of the brain. And so it's really our job now, in this time, in this age, to really focus on trying to stay in this part of our brain. So that's the last part. I'm going to talk about what our job is in this day and age. This is a crazy time. We've never been in anything like this. And quite honestly, it is our responsibility to ourselves, our responsibility to our families, and actually to the whole humanity for us to do our job right now. And our job right now is to focus in on the one variable that changes this. That one variable that really does make a difference here is health. Because that's one thing we do know. We do know that this virus does pick on those who are more vulnerable. We do know that there's specific people with specific conditions who are more at risk. And so if we can, it is our job to start paying attention to our health these days. Because if we think about it, it's never been a priority. It's never really is a priority until now. Now it should be our job and our priority to focus on our health, because that is the one variable that could potentially change this whole risk and rates of complex illness and death. The second thing of our job is we got to continue to distance ourselves, because there's another thing we know about this virus. It's pretty infectious. And we have to actually just slow down the rate of this infection passing to each other. Even though we know a lot of us are going to get infected, we have to slow it down. We have to somehow control the rate of infection so that we can actually make it better for those people who are stuck here. Those of us who are going to be infected, who don't have any symptoms, we still have to socially isolate so we can make it doable for my colleagues to take care of the people that need to be taken care of, to have enough ventilators for the numbers game that we're facing with this. And so we still have to socially isolate for that reason. And then the third part of that being our job is now, I would challenge you to stop following so much of this. Peek in on it once a day and that's it. Numbers are going to be changing. They're going to be going up. We are, ahead of the race. I mean, this is one race you don't want to win, and here we are, good old USA, winning that race. But stop focusing on that. Get over here. And how do you stick in that prefrontal cortex? You stop social media, or at least you limit. You limit that information that's coming in about this. You limit fearful information. You start focusing on being creative, because this is a creative part of our brain. We do things creatively. Whatever creative things you like to do, you like to sew, you like to knit, you like to draw, you like to cook, whatever those things are, start doing that. That helps build up this part of your brain. Meditation, prayer, relaxation, going for a walk, being quiet in your head, taking a nice bath. Those are all these things that help get out of this crazy part of your brain and allows you to start focusing in on this part of your brain, that prefrontal cortex. And sleep. The irony is when you do too much of that, you don't sleep, you watch TV too much, then you continue chasing yourself in that mess. But if you stop and you quiet things down and you let silence, you start hearing the silence, you start hearing the birds, you turn the lights down when it's time for bed, maybe just listen to nice music, you start resetting your brain so that you can sleep better. And it's important to sleep. This is another thing. There's another theory that goes around about sleep. It is important for our cortisol, but there is some thought that maybe when you get good sleep, you're sitting in a lot of melatonin. And there's some ideas that melatonin, it definitely is an anti-inflammatory. It actually supports our immune health, and that's why sleep is important. But specifically for this type of virus infection, as I mentioned in my previous talks, it really pushes the gas on inflammation and pushes what's called a cytokine storm. And melatonin is one of those that actually buffers us and helps us through that. And so that's one of the theories that maybe why elderly patients tend to be more at risk for this type of cytokine storm, or having a complex problem with the cytokine storms because they don't have enough melatonin. Because as we get older, we lose our melatonin, and maybe that's why younger children have done better with this virus because they have higher melatonin rates. That's been a theory. Obviously, there's no evidence with that. There's no evidence about anything with this particular virus because we just haven't had enough time and data. And we obviously aren't testing tests to get enough data. So it's just one of these theories. But anyway, at any rate, sleep is still important for a lot of different reasons, having the right mindset. But that's how we're going to get through this long haul. It is going to be a long haul. And I challenge you as your job is to start changing and shifting your pace in this and the way you approach this and where you put your attention, because that's going to make a difference of where your brain sits. And so I do a lot of work with midbrain problems. That's a lot of anxiety and PTSD. And so, I mean, if you're a person who has a tendency to be more anxious, this situation is revving up your anxiety even more. And so there's a lot of things I do for folks who are in this state from a lifestyle standpoint, from a supportive standpoint, diet, supplements, some things that sort of help with that. But anyway, that's my talk for this week. The numbers game, getting in the right mindset, and doing our job. Thanks for listening. I'll chime in the next couple of days.